Fall asleep to 50 forgotten world. War II facts and events. The world had stopped holding its breath, just for a while. Across the cities of Europe, quiet clocks ticked in soft houses. Markets reopened. Children went back to school. The blood-soaked fields of the Great War were still there, but grass had grown again. Nature, as always, was forgetting faster than the people who had lived through it. The war that ended in 1918 was supposed to be the last one. At least that's what the tired voices whispered when they looked at their sons. And yet, in the corners of drawing rooms, in the rustling papers of dusty offices, the cracks were already returning. Not loudly. Not yet. They returned with ink and silence, with speeches no one interrupted, with quiet bitterness that sat in the stomachs of men who remembered too much and forgave too little. But most people didn't know. Or maybe they didn't want to. They danced again. In Berlin, they called it the Golden Age, but it flickered like a candle in wind. In Paris, the old soldiers limped through side streets while jazz spilled from upstairs windows. In London, the rain still fell, the buses still stopped, and no one spoke about the war anymore unless they had to. All across the continent, the poor tried to stay warm, and the rich tried to stay distracted. Everyone wanted rest. They wanted normal. But peace had come like a guest who never unpacked. It was never meant to stay. Factories started running again, but they made different things now. Not rifles, not yet. But uniforms, boots, radios. Quiet preparations that didn't make headlines. In Germany, something colder was growing beneath the surface. They said their wounds had never healed. They said they had been humiliated. They said they were promised peace, but were left with broken cities and empty wallets. And there was one man who turned their grief into fire. Not right away. He waited in the dark for years, learning which words made the crowd stay silent. Learning which fears kept the working man awake at night. In Italy, another man already walked with medals on his chest. In Japan, new generals whispered old dreams about empire. In Russia, a steel-eyed leader smiled for the camera while he erased those who stood near him. But to most people, these were distant stories. Faces in black and white newspapers. Headlines meant for someone else. People still went on with birthdays and funerals. They stood in bread lines and kissed their children goodnight. The world had been wounded, but life continued with a strange kind of hope. Not the loud, bright kind, but the quiet kind that helps a mother sew buttons back on a coat. There were warnings, of course. There are always warnings. Small invasions, trade deals that felt uneasy, secret police in new uniforms, but there was also denial, the softest and most dangerous force of all. It moves like sleep. It says maybe things won't get worse. Maybe someone else will fix it. Maybe the anger will burn itself out. And so, the world stayed still, not because it was calm, but because it was exhausted. Too tired to face what was coming. Too tired to turn back. And somewhere, far from the polished rooms of government buildings, the first children born after the Great War were turning 17. They did not remember the trenches. They had not seen the gas. They knew only stories, half forgotten by fathers who rarely spoke. They didn't know they were the next ones. They were still laughing, still in school, still writing letters about music and summer, and just beyond them, the shadows stretched longer. They had signed the treaty because they had no choice. It was written in halls that smelled of stone and leather. Painted ceilings, soft voices, and cold signatures. The Treaty of Versailles ended one war, but it carved new wounds into the ones who were made to kneel. Germany had lost more than territory. It had lost its voice, its pride, its future. To many, it was not peace, it was punishment with a ribbon. And punishment does not stay quiet for long. The debts were impossible, and the humiliation endless. For every loaf of bread that cost a wheelbarrow of money, resentment grew. For every factory shut down, 1,000 men grew angry in silence. Politicians in Europe toasted stability, but outside, in the streets, something ancient stirred again. The feeling of being forgotten. In France, they felt fear more than peace. They had watched too many suns not return. They wanted walls, not promises. And so they built them. Great lines of defense buried in the soil, bunkers, tunnels, steel doors that led nowhere. The Maginot Line was meant to protect, but it was built with the memory of an old war, not the shape of a new one. Meanwhile, in Britain, the war-weary public still believed in balance. They believed that diplomacy, kindness, and time would hold the world together. They underestimated the hunger of those who felt robbed by fate. In Germany, as new leaders emerged, they saw the treaty not as a document but as a wound, and they vowed to undo it. Not with words, but with steel. The years passed with quiet changes. Factories once idle came back to life, disguised under the name of jobs programs and pride. Pilots trained in secret. Troops marched when no one looked. And the world, still drunk on the fantasy of peace, looked away. There were too many distractions. Stock markets crashed. Empires cracked. Unemployment rose. And in the confusion, those who dreamed of war found room to grow. Nationalism crept into textbooks. Uniforms returned to the streets. Flags waved with harder edges. Children were taught who to hate and why. And those who questioned, who warned, who whispered, who stood too tall, slowly disappeared from view. Beyond Europe, other tensions simmered in distant lands. Japan, once an island nation of poets and monks, had become something sharper. After the First World War, it had been promised respect, but felt it never received it. So it turned inward, then outward. It needed resources, space, recognition. So it moved toward China, first with business, then with soldiers. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria. The world issued statements, but nothing happened. No armies moved to stop them. No punishments came. The League of Nations held meetings. But peace without strength is only delay. And Japan understood that. So they stayed, and built, and planned. Because when silence follows violence, it is not peace. It is a permission. In Italy, the idea of greatness returned as theatre. Black shirts marched in Rome. Trains ran on time, they said. But behind the speeches and statues, there was something colder. Italy had fought in the Great War and been promised a share of the spoils. When that didn't come, bitterness festered. Mussolini fed it well. He spoke of empire, of Africa, of Rome reborn. In 1935, he sent troops into Ethiopia. There were protests, there were meetings, but nothing stopped them, and nothing was meant to. Because the world, still fragile from one war, did not believe it could survive another. In Spain, the earth itself seemed to crack open. The civil war that began in 1936 was not just about Spain. It was a rehearsal, a warning, a test. Germany sent planes. Italy sent soldiers. Russia sent weapons. The world watched as cities burned, as civilians were bombed, as neighbors became enemies. Guernica, once a quiet town, became a name the world would not forget, or pretend not to remember. The democracies of the West stood still, offering only words. And in that stillness, the men who dreamed of empire took note. Spain was not the cause. It was the sign that the old world was crumbling, that the new one was already here. It is easy, from a distance, to think the world did not know what was coming. But the signs were everywhere, on posters, in headlines, in whispers, and yet denial is stronger than reason. The idea that someone else would stop it, that it would pass, that it was all noise, but the noise kept growing, so slowly at first that no one thought to listen. But it grew, and underneath it something deeper, a rhythm of preparation, of fear, of inevitability, the drumbeat of history, muffled for now, but growing louder with every passing year. And still, life went on. Couples married, babies were born, bicycles filled the narrow streets of Prague and Budapest. Theatres in Vienna reopened, painters painted, bakers baked. But in Berlin, the sound of boots became more common than birdsong. Books vanished from shelves, people vanished from streets. In Moscow, the snow covered secrets. In Paris, cafes still glowed. But they did not feel safe anymore. And in London, the radio warned without panic. People still hoped, still prayed, still believed. But the storm was moving closer, and the air had begun to change. In 1938, it arrived again, softly. The German army entered Austria, not with gunfire, but with flowers. The people cheered. Cameras rolled. The Anschluss, they called it. A reunion. But reunions are not always voluntary. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who were different disappeared. But the world accepted it. Austria, after all, had not fought back, and perhaps that made it easier to forget. Later that year, Hitler demanded more. The Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, he said it was filled with Germans. He said he was only protecting them. At Munich, Britain and France agreed to give it to him. They called it peace. He called it a beginning. The man who returned from Munich, waving a piece of paper and speaking of peace in our time, believed what he said. Maybe he had to. Maybe he hoped words could still stop what was already in motion. But some things, once broken, cannot be undone with signatures. The soldiers were already moving. The borders had already changed. The war, though not yet declared, had already begun, not with battle, but with the silence of too many people looking away. And the people who would pay for it, the young, the poor, the distant, had not even packed their bags. By early 1939, few illusions remained. Germany had taken Austria, then the Sudetenland, then the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler had promised he would stop, then he didn't. Mussolini made promises of steel. Stalin watched, waited. Japan was already deep in China, and yet the world still walked forward, slowly, like sleepwalkers near a cliff. The pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939 surprised many, but not those who understood power. Two ideologies, once enemies, now bound by convenience. They would divide Poland, and then the world would divide with them. When the first bombs fell on Warsaw in September 1939, it was not a surprise, but it was still a shock. Suddenly the air was not quiet. Trains carried soldiers, not schoolboys. Fields became front lines. Mothers packed suitcases and did not know what to put inside. And the world woke up. Not to a new conflict, but to the war they had allowed to grow in silence. The war that had waited patiently. The war that now arrived like thunder in the bones. This was how it began. Not with a single day, but with years of forgetting. Years of hoping. Years of pretending the fire would not come. But fire does not wait. And now, it had returned. The morning light on Warsaw was soft, almost apologetic. It glowed through windows as if the sky hadn't yet learned how to make war. But below that light, a different kind of sky was coming. On September 1st, 1939, the sound that cracked across Poland was not thunder. It was steel. It was engines. It was invasion. Germany moved swiftly. The tanks were not slow this time. They did not wait like they had in the trenches of the past. They rolled with precision. They rolled with hunger. The word for it was blitzkrieg, lightning war. But to those who lived it, it was simply fear. It was the sound of boots on cobblestones, the sound of glass breaking at dawn, the sound of everything familiar, taken too fast. Poland had been promised help. Britain and France had signed their names. But when the German war machine came east, those promises arrived late. The Polish army fought with courage, with horses against tanks, with rifles against wings. But courage cannot hold back storm clouds. Warsaw was bombed until its voice was hoarse. Families fled, but the roads were thick with others. No one knew where safety was. The maps no longer made sense. And then, just 17 days later, from the other side, another army came. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. A quiet agreement no one had wanted to believe had become real. The country was split in two. No battle could be won on both fronts. And so Poland fell, not because it lacked spirit, but because it had been left surrounded. This was not just conquest. It was collapse. Cities were pulled apart. Names were changed. Borders redrawn with ink that felt permanent. But in every farmhouse, every apartment, a quiet resistance began. Men and women hid radios under floorboards. Children ran messages between towns. Priests whispered warnings in confessionals. The official war had begun, but so had the invisible one. Fought in silence, in codes, in dark rooms with no windows. The Polish people, though conquered, would not disappear. They would become one of the most relentless underground networks in the war. But that part of the story would take time. For now, the flames were just beginning to spread. While Poland was being erased from maps, the West held its breath. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but did not move. No armies marched. No shots were fired. For months, the world stood still. This was the phony war, they called it, or the sitting war. In truth, it was fear. France waited behind its Great Wall, the Maginot Line, hoping the enemy would knock on another door. Britain sent leaflets over German towns instead of bombs, still hoping perhaps they could turn back what had already begun. But war does not wait for permission. It only waits for timing. And in the north, Hitler saw opportunity. He looked toward Norway, not for conquest in the old sense, but for strategy. Iron ore, the blood of his industry, passed through Narvik. He needed that supply, and he needed control. In April of 1940, the German forces moved into Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered in a day. It was too small to resist. But Norway fought. Its people watched their long, narrow homeland fill with foreign soldiers. Oslo was taken. Narvik saw gunfire. The mountains echoed with the sound of planes. British forces attempted a defense. French troops came too. But it was too little. Too late. The Germans had already dug in. The invasion of Norway was not just a battle. It was a lesson. That neutrality meant little now. That geography could no longer protect you. That the sea, once a barrier, had become a highway. And far away in Britain, the failure in Norway reached the halls of power. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had once waved the paper of peace, was now replaced. A new man stepped forward. Older, heavier, with a voice like gravel. Winston Churchill. He did not promise peace. He did not soften words. He only said that he would not surrender. And the people listened, because they had run out of patience with promises. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Kremlin, a different kind of silence spread. The Soviet Union had taken its part of Poland, but it was not finished. In November 1939, it turned northward, toward Finland. The tiny nation refused to move its border, refused to obey. And so the Red Army came. The Winter War began. The Soviets expected an easy victory, but the Finns fought back with snow, with forests, with ghosts. White-clad snipers haunted the trees. Frozen lakes swallowed tanks. The Soviets were stronger, larger, louder, but they were not prepared for resistance born from ice and memory. Though Finland eventually lost territory, it did not break. The world watched again, and learned again that spirit was not measured in numbers. By the spring of 1940, the map was changing faster than the weather. Germany now held much of Central and Northern Europe. Britain stood alone, an island wrapped in fog and worry. France waited behind its wall, hoping the future would arrive slowly. But it didn't. On May 10th, Germany struck again, this time with fury. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. Small nations, taken quickly. Then came France, not in the way they expected. The Maginot Line stood tall on the German border, so the German forces simply went around. Through the Ardennes, a forest everyone believed was impassable. But nothing was impassable now. The tanks rolled through with terrifying speed. France fell not because it was weak, but because it had planned for the wrong war. By June, Paris was under German control. The Eiffel Tower stood, but not proudly. The French government fled south. A new regime was formed in Vichy, one that cooperated with the occupiers. Some called it pragmatic. Others called it betrayal. Either way, the country was divided. And once again, the world watched a proud nation fold beneath the weight of old assumptions. But not everyone fled. Some stayed behind. Some began to resist. A young man in a bookstore whispered messages into envelopes. A housewife carried radio parts in her basket. A priest offered hiding to a stranger. These were not soldiers, but they would become a different kind of army, invisible, patient, and everywhere. The resistance in France would grow from embers, but even in these first moments, the fire had begun. In Britain, the news of France's fall sent chills through every village. Suddenly, the enemy was just across the channel. In the air, the Royal Air Force trained in silence. On the sea, every boat was counted. And inland, children were evacuated to the countryside. Gas masks were handed out. Blackout curtains were drawn. And still, people went to work. Still, tea was poured. The world had changed, but habits did not. This, too, was a form of resistance. And then came Dunkirk. British and French soldiers, cut off and cornered, stood with their backs to the sea. The beaches were too shallow for warships, so the call went out. And hundreds of small boats, fishing vessels, pleasure cruisers, ferries, crossed the channel under the shadow of a German fire. They came not for glory, but for their sons, their husbands, their neighbours. In just over a week, more than 300,000 men were brought home. It was not a victory, but it was not defeat. It was survival. And sometimes, in war, that is the only thing that matters. The fire had begun. It had moved through forests and rivers, cities and skies, and yet, this was only the start. The world was not ready for how far it would reach, not ready for how long it would burn. The children who had laughed beneath cherry trees in the spring of 1939 now whispered prayers in bunkers. The sound of footsteps at night no longer meant family. It meant fear. And in the distance, across deserts, oceans, and islands not yet named, more pieces were moving. The war had begun in Europe, but it would not stay there. The summer of 1940 arrived like a silent tide, washing over a Europe that had already begun to forget the sounds of peace. France, once a proud and confident nation, now stood fractured beneath the weight of occupation and betrayal. The Maginot Line, that great symbol of hope and defense, was never the wall it was meant to be. It was a monument to assumptions, an armor forged for the last war, not this new and changing one. German forces had bypassed it, sweeping through the Ardennes forest with a speed and cunning that shocked the world. The trees, once ancient witnesses to centuries of history, now hid shadows darker than any before. The French armies, divided and outmaneuvered, retreated. Paris fell in a whisper rather than a roar, the streets quiet but heavy with fear. The city's heart beat slower beneath the ever-watchful gaze of soldiers who wore a different uniform, who spoke a language that was no longer welcome. The government fled south to Vichy, a place once known for its healing waters and quiet spas. There, under grey skies, a new regime was born, one that would bear the heavy burden of collaboration. It was a bitter choice, shaped by fear and the cruel calculus of survival. Some saw it as pragmatism, others saw the beginning of betrayal. But the people, caught between hope and despair, continued their lives. Markets opened. Children still played in courtyards. The streets hummed with the quiet noise of everyday survival. Yet beneath that hum, the whispers of resistance began to swell. Small acts of defiance, unnoticed by the powerful, grew into a current that could not be stopped. A book hidden in a drawer, A message passed in. The dark. The flame of freedom flickered in shadows, waiting for breath. While France reeled, Britain stood firm like a lonely island in an angry sea. Its skies filled with the engines of the Royal Air Force, pilots who knew that the coming battle was more than just machines. It was a fight for hope itself. Neville Chamberlain's calm voice had faded, replaced by Winston Churchill's steady defiance. Churchill did not promise peace, but he promised resistance. His words, rough and firm, carried across radio waves into homes filled with candlelight and hushed conversations. People listened, their hearts steadying, because in his voice there was a refusal to bow. Evacuations of children to the countryside emptied the streets, and gas masks were issued in preparation for the darkness that might come. The world had changed, but life went on. Then came Dunkirk, an evacuation that was less a retreat and more a rescue of a generation. Trapped between the sea and the enemy, hundreds of thousands of soldiers faced the unimaginable. The beaches were filled with despair and hope in equal measure. But from the shore came an answer. Not from battleships alone, but from small fishing boats, pleasure crafts, and anything that could float. These vessels crossed the channel under the shadow of bombs and bullets. They carried not weapons, but lives. Fathers, brothers, sons, all pulled from the brink by the hands of strangers. It was a miracle of survival, not a victory of war. The beaches remained empty after the ships left, but the spirit of those who escaped was unbroken. It was a testament that even in loss, there could be endurance. Behind the lines, in the occupied zones, the quiet war began. Men and women who had not signed up for soldiers' lives took up different weapons, letters, codes, sabotage. They became the invisible army, the resistance. In Paris, a young bookseller slipped messages between pages. In rural villages, farmers hid radio transmitters beneath haystacks. Every whisper became a weapon, every glance a promise. The occupiers could see the surface, but beneath it the currents of rebellion grew stronger. It was a slow, patient war. It was fought in silence and shadows, with risks that could end lives in a moment. Far from Europe's battlefields, the world was already turning toward new fronts. North Africa, a land of shifting sands and ancient ruins, had become a prize for powers hungry for control. Italian forces, led by Mussolini's ambitions, marched into deserts that swallowed men and machines alike. The harsh sun beat down on soldiers whose uniforms were not enough to shield them from the heat and uncertainty. British forces fought back, moving through the dunes with determination born of necessity. The Desert War was brutal, a test of endurance as much as skill. It was a place where supply lines were as deadly as bullets, and where each victory was measured in small gains. Meanwhile, in the east, Japan's ambition spread like a shadow across the seas. After years of quiet expansion, they moved deeper into China, where ancient cities and rivers became battlegrounds. The world watched with growing concern, but distance made it feel like a distant storm. Yet for those caught in the conflict, every day was a struggle for survival. The silence of the international response was its own kind of violence. It was permission given in the form of inaction. The machinery of empire churned quietly, even as voices called for peace. Back in Europe, the balance of power shifted with every move. The alliances that had seemed solid cracked under pressure. The Soviet Union, watching from the east, played its own game of survival and expansion. Its gaze moved westward, waiting, calculating. The pact signed with Germany was a fragile thread stretched over a chasm of distrust. Both knew the war was not over. It had only changed shape. And behind closed doors, plans were made that would redraw the map again. As autumn turned to winter, the world held its breath. The march of power was relentless. Borders changed, cities fell, and lives were forever altered. The people, caught between fear and hope, moved like shadows through a landscape scarred by ambition. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, filling the air with tension and loss. And in the quiet moments, when the guns fell silent, the cost was measured not just in territory, but in the endless stories of those who waited. For letters that never came, for loved ones who never returned, for a peace that felt as distant as the stars. The war was no longer contained within the borders of Europe. It had spread its restless fingers across the vast deserts, the dense jungles, and the scattered islands of the world. In North Africa, the sun burned with a fierce heat that seemed to mirror the fire of conflict. The endless sands stretched like a sea of glass, shimmering with the promise of both death and survival. Italian forces, bolstered by dreams of empire, marched across this desolate landscape, but they found a resistance as harsh as the desert itself. The British, seasoned by years of war in distant lands, met them with quiet determination. Tanks roared through rocky valleys, and the wind carried the scent of gunpowder and dust. The desert was no place for grand battles of old. It was a war of patience, endurance, and small victories that weighed heavily on the souls of the men who fought beneath the unforgiving sun. Far to the east, the rhythm of war beat in a different key. Japan's ambitions pushed across the seas, reaching into lands ancient and vast. The once isolated island nation had transformed itself into a force with dreams as large as the ocean. China, with its crowded cities and winding rivers, became a battleground that few in the West fully understood. Bombs fell silently in the night, tearing through neighborhoods and markets. Families were uprooted, their homes swallowed by smoke and rubble. But the world's eyes were elsewhere, drawn to the fires of Europe, distracted by the pounding of artillery and the march of armies. Japan's advance was a slow, burning flame, but no less deadly. It was a war fought in shadows, in silence, in places where words rarely traveled. The Burma Road, a narrow lifeline carved through mountains and jungle, became a symbol of resilience and risk. Supplies crossed treacherous paths, evading enemy forces who sought to choke the flow of hope. Every shipment was a gamble. Every soldier carrying precious cargo understood that the road was more than dirt and stone. It was a thread that connected distant lands, fragile and vital. The people who lived along the road watched the war move through their villages, their faces marked by fear and quiet courage. Their stories would remain largely forgotten, whispered only in the silence of post-war memories. Across the Pacific, scattered islands became the stage for a different kind of war. Small and isolated, they held strategic value that made them targets for both sides. Soldiers landed on beaches where palm trees swayed, the tropical air heavy with anticipation. The ocean waves hid dangers beneath their blue surface. Battles here were fought not just with weapons, but with will. The will to hold ground, to survive the relentless heat, the diseases, the loneliness. These places were often overlooked in the grand narratives, but they were no less real. Each island was a world unto itself, where life and death danced a fragile dance. Back in Europe, the fires of war consumed not only lands, but hearts. The war was becoming total, touching every life, every home. Ration cards replaced full cupboards. The sound of children's laughter was muffled by the weight of loss. On the airwaves, voices spoke of victory and hope, but behind the words lay exhaustion and fear. The factories churned day and night, powered by the hands of women who had stepped into roles once held by men. Their work was the pulse of the war effort, unseen yet indispensable. They built planes, assembled guns, kept the machines moving. Their quiet strength was a foundation beneath the thunder of battle. In the secret rooms of intelligence agencies, codebreakers bent over machines that clattered like distant storms. They translated whispers in the dark, turning enemy secrets into lifelines. Their work was silent, shadowed by the roar of guns and the cries of battlefields. But without them, the tides might have turned differently. They were the unseen eyes and ears, catching the faintest hint of movement, the softest breath of plans. Their patience and skill saved lives in ways that few would ever know. Amidst the chaos, ordinary people sought solace in small routines. Letters were written in trembling hands, sent with hope across miles of war-torn land. Families gathered for quiet meals, holding on to each other against the encroaching night. The war was a storm, but in the hearts of many, a candle still burned. It was this fragile light that kept the world from falling completely into darkness. The war was no longer a distant story. It was a present reality, stretching from deserts to jungles, from islands to cities. It was a fire that consumed, but also a force that revealed the depths of human resilience. And as the world burned, beneath the smoke and the ash, the threads of connection held firm, woven by courage, sacrifice, and the quiet hope for peace. War is often thought of as distant battles, faraway fields, and soldiers marching beneath foreign skies. But for millions, it was a storm that rolled into their streets, their homes, their everyday lives. The war at home was quieter, less dramatic in sound, but just as profound in its cost. It was measured in ration books, blackouts, and the steady hum of factories. It was felt in empty chairs around dinner tables, in whispered prayers at night, and in the steady tightening of the heart. Cities became frontlines too, not with guns and tanks, but with waiting, loss, and the courage to carry on. In Britain, the Battle of Britain was not just fought in the skies, but in the homes below. The drone of enemy aircraft was a constant reminder that no place was truly safe. The blackout curtains were drawn early, hiding windows from view, casting rooms into early night. Children learned to sleep through the sounds of sirens and explosions. The streets emptied quickly when the warning bells rang, and neighbors huddled together in shelters beneath earth and stone. The threat was invisible, yet all-encompassing. The sky was both protector and predator. The courage to face the unknown came not from bravery alone, but from a quiet resilience born of routine, knowing what to do when the world trembled. Women stepped forward to fill the gaps left by men at the front. Their days were filled with work that was both new and essential. In factories, they assembled planes, riveted ships, and rolled endless miles of wire. They learned to operate machines that hummed and clattered, often with no end in sight. Theirs was a work of endurance, of sweat and steady hands. They carried the weight of both home and war, balancing fear with determination. They were the backbone of the effort. Unseen heroes who shaped the course of history not with rifles, but with steel and will. Rationing became a daily reality. Food, clothing, fuel, all carefully measured, carefully saved. Families planned meals around scarce ingredients, finding creativity in limitation. Black market whispers circulated, but most tried to endure honestly. Gardens turned into patches of hope, where vegetables grew beneath the watchful eyes of weary hands. The war was not just fought on battlefields, but in kitchens and markets, in small acts of sacrifice that added up to survival. The sharing of a loaf of bread, the careful mending of a child's worn coat, these quiet choices were acts of resistance, statements that life would go on. Meanwhile, propaganda filled the airwaves and pages of newspapers, shaping thoughts and keeping morale afloat. Posters with bright colors and bold slogans lined the streets. Voices on the radio spoke of victory, of duty, of sacrifice. The truth was more complicated, buried beneath layers of hope and fear. Families heard news from the front lines, often waiting days for letters that might never come. They lived in the tension between hope and dread, holding onto fragments of information as if they were lifelines. The silence between broadcasts was sometimes the loudest sound. In occupied countries, the war at home took on darker forms. The presence of enemy soldiers in familiar streets was a daily wound. The rules of occupation were strict and often brutal. Curfews limited movement. Secret police watched. Neighbors disappeared without explanation. The fear was constant and quiet, a shadow that lengthened with each passing day. Yet even in these darkest places, Sparks of resistance glowed. People smuggled food, hid fugitives, passed messages. They risked everything for moments of freedom, for acts of kindness that defied the cold order of occupation. Children who had known only peace now learned the language of war early. They hid in basements during raids, carried gas masks oversized for their small hands, and grew up fast in the shadow of destruction. Their laughter was sometimes brittle, their dreams tempered by reality. Schools closed and reopened, always uncertain. Yet in playgrounds and classrooms, life tried to bloom stubbornly. Teachers became more than educators. They were guardians of hope, keeping alive the belief that one day the world would be whole again. In the United States, before it officially entered the war, life was a mix of isolation and preparation. Factories shifted from making cars to making tanks. Men and women trained for the possibility of conflict, though many hoped it would never come. When the attack on Pearl Harbor finally shattered the quiet, the nation's sleep ended abruptly. The war became everyone's business. Families watched the newsreels, packed bags for loved ones sent overseas, and adjusted to new rhythms that pulsed with urgency. The war at home was a story of endurance. It was measured in moments. The quiet turning of a page in a ration book, the steady drip of rain on a blackout curtain, the small triumphs of a garden's first harvest. It was the sound of community holding together in the face of fear, the strength found in ordinary days made extraordinary by courage. It was the hidden cost of conflict, the unseen battle that shaped the world just as much as the fighting in fields and skies. Between the battles, there was silence. Not always the silence of peace, but the silence of waiting. Soldiers stood in trenches, eyes scanning foggy hills, hearts thudding softly beneath their uniforms. In the moments between movement, the war felt like a dream too heavy to wake from. The mud, the cold, the dampness that heat clung to the skin. These became the language of life. No one spoke loudly. Voices were low, practical, reserved. Jokes, when they came, were dry and brief. Even laughter had a tired sound to it, as though it knew the danger of being too loud. The soldiers waited not just for the next order, but for time to pass, for letters, for sleep, for a reason to believe the waiting would end. It didn't feel like glory. It felt like holding your breath forever. Far behind the lines, the silence had a different shape. In offices filled with smoke and paper, men drew arrows on maps and circled dates no one else could see. The plans were written in ink, but their consequences would be written in blood. Diplomats shifted their weight behind closed doors, offering promises that held for only a day. Orders were typed slowly. They passed from hand to hand. And then they travelled, quietly, through telegraphs, messengers, whispers. Whole movements of troops began in rooms where the only sound was a pen scratching paper. War, at its core, was a slow engine. Each gear moved with purpose, but from a distance it was all so quiet. In the cities, silence came like fog. There were fewer cars, fewer voices. People moved more quickly, with less purpose. The streets were not empty, but they felt hollow. Lights were dimmed at night. Radios were turned low. Even the bells of churches seemed to ring with more hesitation. Some buildings stood damaged but untouched, as if frozen mid-collapse. Others had vanished entirely, reduced to piles of brick and memory. The people who walked past them looked away. They had already learned how to carry grief without showing it. They had grown used to holes in the ground, in walls, in families. Between the noise of battles and the silence of mourning, there was something worse. Numbness. The factories kept working. They didn't wait for battles to end or begin. The machines made their steady music. Clatter, hum, hiss. Day and night. They moved without pause. Women in overalls wiped sweat from their brows, hands raw from the work. They knew what they made would go far away. They didn't know if it would come back. Crates were filled, stamped, and loaded. In those quiet halls, the rhythm was a kind of comfort. a pattern to hold on to. Outside, trains rumbled by, carrying more of what the war required. No one spoke to the men on board. They just watched them pass. Some waved, most did not. In hospitals, silence lived between coughs, between footsteps, between the sounds of metal trays. The wounded lay in rows, some stared at the ceiling. Some didn't speak at all. Nurses moved from bed to bed, offering care that words could not. Letters from home were read aloud. Sometimes they brought smiles, sometimes tears, but often the soldier simply nodded, grateful for the sound of something soft. Doctors stitched, bandaged, amputated. Their hands moved with habit. They had learned to be quick and quiet and unshaken. Outside, ambulances came and went. The war did not pause for recovery. Across the seas, submarines waited in silence beneath the waves. Their world was steel and shadows. The only sound was the creak of metal and the quiet breathing of men who had been beneath the surface too long. They counted days by meals. They measured distance by pressure. When orders came, they surfaced, struck, then disappeared again. Their war was cold, hidden, and relentless. They lived in the space between discovery and silence, always listening, always hoping not to be heard. In the air, silence was a lie. Planes roared when they flew, but between missions, the airfields were still. Pilots smoked quietly. Some carved names into wood. Others stared at photographs of people they might never see again. The crew checked the engines, oiled the parts, tightened the bolts. The planes sat like birds waiting to fly into storms. No one said what they feared. They only said when they would go. Each mission had a number. Each return was a question. And yet, the silence before takeoff always held something sacred. The brief moment when the sky was still and the world hadn't yet changed. In the prisons, silence became punishment. Captured spies, resistance fighters, innocent civilians, they waited behind bars, in rooms too small for dreaming. Some scratched marks into the wall, others recited prayers. Torture did not always come with sound. Sometimes it came with waiting, with hunger, with the knowledge that you had been forgotten. In the camps, the silence was heavier, too heavy. A silence born of cruelty so deep, it seemed to reach into the bones of the earth. No voice could fill it. No story could explain it. Those who survived remembered not just the screams, but the times when there were no screams, when even pain had been worn out. In the countryside, the silence was more peaceful. But even peace carried worry. Farmers woke early, not to alarms, but to the quiet wind across their fields. The soil still needed turning. The animals still needed feeding. But something was missing. Sons, brothers, labor replaced by memory. The farms did not speak of war, but they lived its echo. Letters came slowly, often folded with care. When one arrived, it was opened with both hope and dread. In those quiet places, the war felt like a long winter. Cold, patient, waiting to pass. For children, the silence took strange shapes. In bomb shelters, they sat beside their mothers, learning to be still. In classrooms, they practiced ducking beneath desks, though they barely understood why. At night, the sounds outside their windows were not lullabies, but the occasional thud of distant guns. Yet they played. They made games out of scrap metal. They told stories. Their laughter, when it came, was the most honest sound in the world. But even it was quieter now. They had learned too early the value of silence. In resistance networks, silence was a weapon. Messages passed in code. Radios clicked softly. A wrong word, a wrong glance, could destroy everything. Yet these networks thrived on patience. A train sabotaged. A bridge collapsed. A courier slipping through the woods with forged papers hidden in her shoes. Each act was small, but together they were thunder in waiting. And always the silence before the strike was the hardest part. the holding of breath, the knowledge that everything might end or begin. Between battles, the world did not sleep, but it listened, it watched, it prepared. The silence was not empty, it was full of the weight of things to come. Soldiers cleaned their rifles again, generals reviewed maps again, mothers set extra plates, just in case. Radio operators waited for static to shift into meaning. Medics restocked bandages, engineers checked the treads on tanks. The silence was not rest, it was rehearsal. And when the battles came again, as they always did, the noise would rise. Explosions, commands, cries, engines, and then, just as suddenly, it would fall back into silence again. That was the rhythm of war, not constant action, but the slow inhale and exhale of destruction. The quiet was not peace, but it was what the world had between moments of chaos. It was in that silence that hope hid, that doubt grew, that decisions were made. It was in that silence that the war waited, watching everyone who dared to forget it, even for a moment. The war had reached its middle. The world was heavy with fatigue, but still it turned, still it burned. No one could pretend it would end quickly. No one believed in clean endings anymore. Everywhere, something was shifting. The promises made in the beginning of swift victories, of brave crusades, were cracking under the weight of years. What remained were choices, many of them bitter, all of them costly. In those turning points, the truth of the war revealed itself, not as glory, but as persistence, not as triumph, but as endurance. It was not one great moment, but 1,000 small ones, shaped by men and women who did not seek history, only survival. In 1941, a new front opened with a sound like tearing paper. Germany turned east, breaking the uneasy pact it had made with the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began with speed and fire. The German army moved into the wide plains of the USSR, pushing through Ukraine, Belarus, toward Leningrad, toward Moscow. The invasion was vast, one of the largest ever undertaken. Millions of troops, thousands of tanks, a line of steel stretching across the continent. The air was filled with the dust of movement and the smell of fuel. In the early days, victory seemed certain. Soviet forces were caught off guard. Town after town fell. But the land was wide. The land was ancient. And it did not break easily. The Soviet people, stunned and bloodied, did not collapse. They retreated, then returned. Whole factories were dismantled and moved eastward, rebuilt behind the Ural Mountains. Workers labored in freezing halls, under dim lights, forging weapons, not just of steel, but of memory. Civilians dug trenches with their hands, teenagers picked up rifles. Cities were encircled but refused to fall. In Leningrad, the siege began. It would last nearly 900 days. Hunger became the loudest sound in that city. People ate whatever they could find. Paste, glue, sawdust. Yet still they sang. Still they worked. Still they endured. This was not the war the Germans had expected. This was something deeper, older, harder to defeat. The winter came and it changed everything. The German army, dressed for quick conquest, found itself wrapped in snow and silence. Engines froze, men froze, supply lines stretched and snapped. The cold was not an enemy you could shoot. It simply waited and took what it wanted. And as the frost deepened, the Red Army began to rise again. Slowly, then with force. The tide was turning, not all at once, but inch by inch. Foot by foot. Moscow held. Leningrad endured. The Soviet heart had been wounded, but it beat still. In the Pacific, a different kind of turning point approached. For years, tensions had grown between Japan and the United States. Diplomatic talks faltered. Sanctions were imposed. But the deeper truth was this. Both nations knew war was coming. The question was only when. On December 7th, 1941, the answer arrived. Japanese planes filled the skies over Pearl Harbor, a quiet harbor in Hawaii where American ships slept at anchor. In a matter of hours, Fire and metal rained down. Battleships burned. Men leapt into oil-slick waters. The attack was swift, brutal, and shocking. Over 2,000 lives were lost. The silence afterward was filled with resolve. The United States entered the war, no longer an observer, but a participant with full voice. Factories shifted into full production. Millions enlisted. The country became a giant of effort and steel. The scale changed overnight. A new tide had entered the war. Across Europe, across Asia, the news echoed. America had arrived. And with it came hope and fear and the certainty that the war had grown larger still. Yet, even as alliances deepened, promises were tested. In Asia, colonial powers who had once ruled over lands with distant indifference now needed those same people to fight. In India, in Burma, in the Philippines, native soldiers were asked to die for empires that had long denied them dignity. The contradiction was not lost. In quiet voices, many asked, "What will change when this war is done? Will the world that follows be different, or will we be forgotten again?" The war was turning, but the questions it left behind were only growing. In North Africa, the fighting moved back and forth like breath. The German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, clashed with British forces under harsh sun and shifting sand. Towns were taken, then lost, then taken again. The battles seemed endless, and yet, by late 1942, the tide shifted again. At El Alamein, British forces under General Montgomery struck hard. The victory was not just a military one, it was symbolic. It showed that the enemy could be turned, could be stopped. It was a quiet answer to years of retreat. And in that moment, something hardened in the minds of those who still fought. The belief that this war could somehow be won. Across the Atlantic, ships sailed in convoys, their lights out, their hulls heavy with supplies. German U-boats prowled the waters, silent and deadly. Merchant sailors faced death not in battle, but in cold waves and sudden strikes. The Battle of the Atlantic was not one battle, but many. Fought over thousands of miles, over years. It was a war of endurance, of radar and code breaking, of listening to the sea and trying to understand what it hid. Each sunken ship meant loss. Each safe arrival meant survival. In these dark waters, victory was measured in silence. In the skies over Europe, bombers began their slow missions. Night after night, they flew across darkness, dropping fire over cities already scarred by war. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Entire neighborhoods vanished in smoke. Civilians took shelter in basements, in bunkers, in the space between fear and faith. Children learned to sleep through sirens. Mothers carried water, passed food, comforted strangers. War from above was relentless. There were no front lines anymore. Everywhere had become a battlefield. In occupied lands, hope flickered with each small act. In France, in Norway, in Poland, resistance fighters struck and vanished. Rail lines were cut. Bridges were destroyed. Information moved across borders, carried by men and women whose names history would often forget. Many were captured. Many were killed. But the effort did not stop. The broken promises of freedom could not undo the desire for it. Each act of sabotage was a sentence in a larger story, a refusal to surrender identity, even when the cost was life itself. And in the ghettos and camps, the war took its cruelest shape. Entire communities had been rounded up, forced behind walls, deprived of food, of dignity, of names. In places like Warsaw, the Jewish population lived in unbearable conditions, under daily threat. Disease spread. Starvation was common. Yet even here there were turning points, acts of resistance so bold they burned through despair. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. With few weapons, with little hope, the people fought. They knew the end would be the same, but they chose to face it with defiance. They chose to remind the world that even in the darkest corners, courage could still exist. The promises made by leaders, by powers, by alliances, many of them lay broken now. But from those pieces came something else. A turning not toward victory, not yet, but toward determination. The world was weary, but it was no longer unsure. The question was not whether the war could be won. The question now was how much more must be lost before it was. The maps were still changing. The front lines still shifted. But behind those movements was a quiet force. The will of people who had endured too much to stop now. The turning points of this war were not always visible. They came in moments of decision, of sacrifice, of resolve. They came when someone said no instead of yes, when someone hid a stranger instead of handing them over, when someone chose to keep fighting, not for glory, but because giving up would mean becoming someone they could not bear to be. The war was not yet won, but it was turning. And in that turning, the shape of the future began to appear. Faint, distant, but real. The war did not turn like a wheel snapping into place. It turned like a tide, slowly, reluctantly, uncertainly, washing in over sand and memory, inch by inch. Victories came, but they came at a cost, and they came late. No one cheered loudly anymore. The celebrations were quiet, muted by grief and caution. The enemy had not vanished. The world was not healed. But something had shifted, and it could be felt in the way soldiers looked at the horizon, in the way generals gave their orders, in the way people lit lamps again after long nights of fear. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was something quieter, a kind of fragile hope born not from promises, but from the evidence of survival. In the east, the Red Army was moving. The snow had melted, the roads had hardened, and the tanks rolled forward with a sound that echoed across miles of land still scorched from retreat. The Soviets pushed into territory once lost, into cities and villages that still bore the marks of occupation. They passed by graves dug hastily in fields. They passed by burned churches, empty wells, schools filled with silence, and they kept moving. With each mile gained, they uncovered what the retreating enemy had tried to hide. Mass graves, scorched records, families that had disappeared without a word. It was a reckoning not only with the past, but with the future. The Red Army, vast and exhausted, carried its memories forward like stones in their pockets, and the tide pushed westward. In Italy, the Allies had landed. It had not been easy. It had not been clean. From Sicily to the mainland, they fought against both geography and resistance. The land was narrow, mountainous, difficult. The Germans held it fiercely. Towns were taken street by street. Hills were earned foot by foot. The Italian people watched from shattered windows, caught between collapse and liberation. Mussolini had fallen, then risen again, then fallen once more. Fascism had cracked, but the war remained. In the countryside, partisans rose from the shadows. They carried old rifles, knives, stolen grenades. They fought in forests, in villages, in alleys. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred. The occupation was breaking, but the price of breaking it was high. In the Pacific, the island war raged on. The United States moved from island to island, each one a fortress, each one a grave. The strategy was called island hopping, but there was nothing light about it. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu, the cost was measured in limbs, in silence, in the haunted eyes of men who returned. The Japanese fought with a fury that made surrender unthinkable. Caves became bunkers, hills became strongholds. Every yard was contested. And yet, the tide moved. American ships filled the waters. Their planes darkened the skies. On the ground, Marines moved slowly, steadily, carrying not just weapons, but the weight of comrades left behind. Victory came, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. Back in France, the resistance was growing bolder. Arms drops from the air gave them weapons. Allied intelligence gave them targets. The networks of sabotage grew dense and daring. Rail lines exploded. Bridges collapsed. Messages were passed in code and ink, hidden in seams and hems. In occupied cities, whispers became instructions. The people prepared, quietly for a day that had not yet come. They knew the Allies would return. They didn't know when. But they waited. And while they waited, they fought in silence. Then came June 6th, 1944, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy filled with ships, with men, with noise. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history. Soldiers leapt from boats into cold water, into gunfire, into chaos. Some didn't make it past the surf. Others climbed the bluffs, inching forward under fire. The sand ran red. But the land was taken. The tide had turned. Not all at once. Not easily. But the door had opened. France would not remain under occupation. The slow retreat of German forces had begun. And though it would take months, though it would take more lives, it had begun. The people of Normandy watched the sky fill with parachutes. They opened their homes to the wounded. They buried the dead in quiet rows. The Allied advance continued. Paris was liberated in August. The bells rang again, crowds filled the streets, flowers were thrown, tears fell. The capital had survived, scarred but standing. Yet even in those celebrations, the cost was felt. So many had not lived to see it. So many had vanished without farewell, and even now the war was not over. The enemy was not yet defeated. The final chapter had not yet been written. In Belgium and the Netherlands, liberation was slower. German resistance stiffened. The winter came, supplies thinned, civilians starved. In the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler launched a last desperate offensive. In the forests of the Ardennes, the snow was red again. American forces, surprised and surrounded, held their ground. Bastogne became a name etched in memory. General Patton's tanks arrived, the war had grown thin and stretched. It no longer moved like thunder, but like slow erosion, wearing away strength one layer at a time. The great movements had already passed. Now came the long unraveling, not with fanfare, not with banners, but with tired feet and broken roads. Victory was not a flag on a hill. It was a man waking up after another night without sleep. It was a letter reaching its destination a week too late. It was holding a position for one more hour. It was the silence that followed when someone did not return. The defeats now were not always grand or visible. They were small, quiet, and endless. 1,000 cuts that bled the world toward the end. The Allies pressed deeper into Europe, and each advance uncovered something hollow. Towns stood empty or smouldering. Civilians wandered with lost eyes. The German army, once so sharp, now staggered backward. Their strength was not gone, but it was fraying. Supplies were low, morale was lower, and still they fought, not always for belief, but out of habit. Some clung to duty, others to fear. Many did not know what remained but the next battle. Retreats turned to delays. Defensive lines snapped like old rope. Snow fell across the plains again, covering the damage, but not the truth. The Eastern Front saw a tide that could not be held back. The Red Army pushed through Poland, unstoppable now. The Warsaw Uprising, begun in hope, ended in silence. The people had risen to meet liberation, but the Red Army had waited. And the Germans had crushed the uprising with brutal finality. Whole districts were burned, entire blocks were razed. The Soviets advanced, but the city behind them was ash. In Hungary, in Romania, the same story repeated. Old alliances collapsed. Regimes fell. Soldiers surrendered by the thousands. But each step forward came with a cost. The Soviet forces paid in lives, in villages destroyed, in bridges ruined behind them. On the Western Front, Allied bombers flew their missions with weary precision. Cities like Dresden, once untouched, became targets. The firebombing was relentless. The flames rose high enough to create their own winds. Thousands died. Many burned where they stood. It was said to be strategic, to break the enemy's will, to ruin their supply lines. But the fire did not know strategy. It only knew destruction. Survivors emerged blinking, covered in ash, silent with shock. These were not victories anyone could celebrate. In Italy, the front crawled upward. The Germans dug in at every ridge. The Allies, pushing north, fought the terrain as much as the enemy. Mountains do not yield easily. They offer no cover. The wind is cruel. Soldiers advanced through snow and stone. Towns were taken and taken again. Monte Cassino, an ancient abbey, was bombed into ruin. A place that had stood for centuries fell in a single day. Whether it was necessary remains debated. What is certain is that the stones could not speak to say otherwise. In the Pacific, the losses mounted. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, names that would become symbols of courage and horror. Each island was a maze of tunnels, traps, and waiting enemies. Japanese soldiers fought until the very end. Some refused to surrender even after the battle was lost. The Americans came in waves, and the price was steep. The ground was won foot by foot, inch by inch. Flamethrowers were used in caves, napalm scorched forests. Civilians, caught in the middle, died by the thousands. By now, everyone knew what invasion meant, and everyone feared what would come if Japan itself had to be taken. At sea, kamikaze pilots took to the skies, ready to die for one strike. Their planes hit ships with terrifying force. Steel bent, fire rose. Young men gave their lives not to win, but simply to hurt the enemy. It was sacrifice without hope, and it chilled those who watched. In Germany, the leadership cracked. Hitler had retreated into his bunker. His speeches grew shorter, his eyes more distant. The once mighty Third Reich was collapsing from within, yet many still fought, unwilling to see what had become clear. Children were drafted. Old men were given rifles. There were fewer uniforms, fewer supplies. Some units marched with barely any fuel, but still they moved. Still they obeyed. The idea of surrender had become more frightening than the war itself. In the concentration camps, the defeats were of a different kind. The world was beginning to discover what lay behind the barbed wire. At Auschwitz, at Bergen-Belsen, at Dachau, Allied troops found bodies stacked like logs. Survivors walked like shadows. The smell lingered long after the war. No one spoke loudly. There were no cheers, only questions and the terrible weight of answers. Those who had denied, those who had looked away, now had to see, and seeing changed them. In Britain, in America, in Russia, people read the reports with disbelief. Then came the photographs. The small defeats were now shared. The world understood, too late, what had been done in silence. The war was no longer just about borders. It was about humanity, and what had been lost when no one was watching. Across Europe, surrender became the only option. German units fell back and vanished. Some surrendered in whole divisions, others fought on, pointlessly, stubbornly. The forests hid stragglers. Towns were retaken with little resistance. Others were fought for with shocking fury. But the overall shape was clear. The war was ending. Slowly, bitterly, but ending. In the Pacific, it was not so clear. Japan had not yielded. Despite the bombings, despite the blockade, the government held firm. The emperor remained distant. The military refused to imagine surrender. Cities like Tokyo had been bombed until nothing remained but ruins. Still, the war went on, and the question loomed. How would it end? Would it be invasion? Would it be fire? Would it be something no one could yet name? Even as Germany collapsed, the Pacific remained a storm waiting to break. The home fronts reflected the same fatigue. Rationing continued. Letters still arrived in black-edged envelopes. Mothers stared at windows. Children asked where their fathers had gone. No one celebrated early. Everyone had lost something. and every day the war continued was another small defeat for someone, another loss, another name, another reason to forget how peace had ever felt. The soldiers kept marching, their boots were worn, their uniforms patched. Their eyes told stories they never spoke aloud. They had seen too much. They had given too much. And still they moved forward. The war was almost over. But almost was a long road, full of ruins. It was paved with hunger, with cold, with quiet promises made to ghosts. In Berlin, you could hear the war ending, not with a single sound, but with 100. A girl crying in the rubble, a radio gone silent, a door blown off its hinges swinging in the wind. Somewhere, someone laid down their weapon. Somewhere else, someone refused. The 1,000 small defeats of this long war had left no one untouched. Even those who had survived felt broken in ways they did not yet understand. The victories, when they came, would not be whole. They would be stained, cracked, incomplete. But they would be real. And that, perhaps, would be enough. For now, there was only one thing left to do. Endure. Just a little longer. Just a few more steps. And then, maybe, silence. The end of the war did not come suddenly. It did not arrive like a sunrise, sweeping away darkness in one clean motion. It came in waves, uneven and uncertain, scattered across continents and carried by men who no longer remembered what peace felt like. These final offensives were not driven by hope, but by exhaustion. The commanders pushed forward because stopping would have meant something worse. The soldiers obeyed not because they believed in glory, but because momentum had become the only language they still understood. The will to fight had frayed, but still the guns fired. Still the tanks rolled. Still the bodies fell. In the ruins of Germany, the collapse accelerated. The Allies advanced from the west, and the Soviets closed in from the east. Towns that had once waved flags of conquest now raised white cloths from broken windows. Roads clogged with refugees. Civilians fleeing both sides, unsure which army to trust. Horses pulled carts stacked with bedding, infants and old women too weak to walk. Among them moved retreating soldiers, eyes lowered, uniforms torn, weapons slung without pride. The villages burned behind them. What had begun as a lightning war now ended in ash. Berlin, the heart of it all, stood waiting. The city had known bombings before. Now it would know the final siege. The Soviets reached the outskirts in April. Street by street, they advanced. Buildings became bunkers. Every corner was a defense. Civilians hid in basements, clutching radios and candles, waiting for the knock that might mean death or survival. Hitler remained in his bunker, beneath the garden of a shattered chancery. Above, the city collapsed. Below, his world shrank to maps, orders that no longer mattered, and silence. Those closest to him spoke in whispers. There was no victory left. Only delay. Only denial. On April 30th, he died by his own hand. Others followed. The bunker emptied into legend. Above it, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. The symbol was not just for Germany, it was for the world. And still, not all fighting stopped. Some German units fought on, refusing to believe what had already passed. Others laid down arms with relief so deep it looked like grief. In the forests and fields, weapons were dropped into mud. Helmets left behind like forgotten thoughts. On May 7th, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For many, it felt unreal. Church bells rang, but the sound was thin. People stood in doorways, uncertain whether to cheer. So much had been lost. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered. Entire populations had vanished. The war had ended, but no one knew what to do with the silence that followed. In London, in Paris, in Moscow, crowds gathered. Flags were waved. Kisses exchanged. But even in joy, there was something missing. Those who had truly suffered rarely made noise. They stood off to the side, holding photographs of those who would never return. The victory was real, but it was not clean. It had been earned not just in battles, but in waiting, in weeping, in enduring the unendurable. And across the world, in the Pacific, the war was not over. Japan had not surrendered. Though surrounded, though weakened, the empire still held. Okinawa had just fallen, but only after months of fighting. The cost was staggering. Civilians had died in tens of thousands. Soldiers too. Kamikaze attacks continued. Ships burst into flame under clear skies. And still, no surrender came. Plans for an invasion of Japan were drawn. The estimates were bleak. American casualties could reach 1 million. Japanese deaths would be higher. The islands were prepared for defense down to the last child. The home islands braced for a final battle that would leave nothing behind. The world hesitated. And then something changed. A weapon unlike any used before had been prepared in secret, deep in the deserts of America. Scientists had spent years unlocking the secrets of energy itself. They called it the Manhattan Project. It ended with a flash in the New Mexico sky. What followed was silence. And then fear. On August 6th, 1945, a single bomb fell on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion erased everything. People turned to shadows on stone. Fire swept across neighborhoods in seconds. Tens of thousands died instantly. Others lingered in pain. The city became a graveyard of smoke and silence. And still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit. The devastation was smaller only in scale. The suffering was the same. By August 15th, the emperor spoke to his people for the first time over radio. He used words few had ever heard him say. He said, the war was over. For the first time in history, Japan surrendered. The war had ended. But not in triumph. In devastation. In stillness. In the heavy quiet of something too big to understand. Across the world, people tried to return to lives they no longer recognized. Soldiers came home to places that had moved on without them. Some could not speak of what they'd seen. Others could not sleep through the night. Families reunited, but with gaps that would never close. Cities rebuilt. Graves were marked. Flags were folded and handed to mothers who did not want them. In the Pacific Islands, in the cities of Europe, in the forests of Eastern Europe, the evidence remained. Burned out tanks, craters in fields, names carved into stone. The war had left fingerprints on everything. In courtrooms, trials began. The leaders of the Nazi regime were held to account. The word genocide became known to the world. At Nuremberg, the crimes were listed. The witnesses spoke. Photographs were shown. And still, there were some who turned their eyes away. Justice moved slowly, imperfectly, but it moved. In Asia, questions lingered. The bomb had ended the war, but it had also opened something darker. The world had seen what fire from the sky could do, and it would not forget. The Cold War began before the Hot War had cooled. The Soviets and Americans eyed each other with unease. The peace was not peace. It was a pause, a breath held, and behind it all, the people tried to rebuild. In Germany, in Japan, in Poland, in France, bricks were laid, roads were cleared. Children played again in places where gunfire had once echoed. But nothing returned to how it had been. The world had changed. The faces of the living were different. The hearts of the survivors carried too many names. The war had taken everything and returned only the chance to begin again. In the years that followed, stories were written, films made, memorials built. But the war was not just in history books. It lived in dreams, in scars, in the quiet moments when someone looked out a window and remembered. The final offensives had ended. The battlefields had emptied. But the war would echo through time in ways no one could fully measure. And in those final days, as the fires dimmed, all that was left was the long, slow work of peace. The moment of collapse did not come as a sudden thunderclap, but as a long, slow unraveling. The breaking of a thread stretched too far, fraying at the edges until it finally gave way. Germany's defeat had torn open a wound across Europe, but the damage beneath the surface was deeper than armies or borders. The cities lay in ruins, their stones scarred by fire and shell. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg. These were names now tied to loss beyond measure. The people wandered through the debris, searching for familiar faces, for echoes of what had been. But in many places, what remained was silence. Families were broken, lives upended, futures uncertain. The sense of collapse was not only in the physical world, but inside the hearts of millions who had lived through years of fear and violence. In the East, the Soviet Union stood victorious but exhausted, its people drained by sacrifice and loss. The Red Army's march had freed lands but left behind a trail of destruction. Cities had been captured only to be shattered. Farms had been burned. Homes abandoned. The Soviet people returned to a landscape that felt both like home and a stranger's land. They began to rebuild with tired hands and wary eyes, knowing that the price of victory was forever etched in the ground beneath their feet. Meanwhile, in Germany, the remnants of a shattered nation faced not just defeat, but reckoning. The Allied powers divided the country into zones, each governed by distant rulers with different goals and visions. Families were split. The flow of refugees surged westward, carrying stories of hardship and hope. Many carried the weight of guilt and shame, others the desperate need to forget. The streets of cities like Munich and Frankfurt filled with people searching for meaning amid the ruins. The camps where unspeakable horrors had unfolded were uncovered. The world saw what had been hidden in darkness. Survivors emerged from shadows, their stories searing the conscience of nations. Trials began at Nuremberg. Justice sought to name crimes and punish those responsible. But justice was complicated, slow, and imperfect. The lines between victim and perpetrator were blurred by years of fear and propaganda. In Japan, the collapse was different but no less profound. The cities lay devastated from bombings, and the population had endured hunger, loss, and fear. The emperor, once thought untouchable, spoke of surrender in a voice heavy with sorrow. The people faced not just defeat, but a deep questioning of identity and future. Occupation forces arrived, bringing both order and uncertainty. The process of rebuilding would be slow, and the scars, physical and emotional, would last generations. Across the Pacific Islands, the aftermath was raw and visible. Coral reefs and beaches bore the marks of battles fought with desperate courage. Small villages were emptied, and old ways of life were lost forever. The war had reached every shore, leaving its imprint on land and memory alike. In the former colonies and occupied nations, the collapse of empires sparked new fires. People who had fought as soldiers or worked as laborers began to demand freedom, equality, and a new place in the world. The war had shown both the brutality of conquest and the strength of resistance. Movements for independence gained momentum, fueled by the contradictions and broken promises of the past. Around the globe, the war's consequences shaped the new order. The United Nations was born with a hope to prevent future conflicts, but the tension between old powers remained. The seeds of the Cold War took root in the division between East and West. Alliances shifted and hardened. The world had changed in ways no one could yet fully grasp. In homes and hearts, the trauma lingered. Soldiers returned carrying wounds unseen. Children grew up with stories half told. The quiet moments, when someone paused by a grave, when a family photo was touched gently, held the weight of memory. Reconstruction began, but so did reflection. What had been lost? What could be saved? The consequences were not only political or military, but deeply personal. The war had changed the way humanity saw itself. The collapse was not just the fall of regimes, but the shattering of illusions. The years that followed were a time of reckoning and rebuilding, of sorrow and cautious hope. The past hung heavy, but the future beckoned, fragile and uncertain. The world stood on the edge of something new, shaped by collapse but also by the stubborn will to heal. Memory is a fragile thing, woven from threads of sorrow and light, of stories told and silences kept. After the war, the world faced not only the task of rebuilding cities and borders, but of carrying the weight of what had been witnessed and what had been lost. The survivors, those who had lived through fire, hunger, fear, and heartbreak, found themselves walking through a landscape of memory that was as heavy as the ruins around them. They carried the faces of the missing in their minds, the echo of names whispered in the quiet, and the shadow of promises broken. In towns shattered by bombs, in villages emptied by violence, the stories of war took root. They were told around fires, in homes rebuilt from ashes, and in quiet moments when grief could be spoken aloud. The cost of remembering was high. Some sought to forget, to close the door on horrors too large to hold. Others chose to speak, to bear witness, so that the silence would not swallow truth. Memorials were built, stone and bronze rising from the ground, as monuments to those who had fallen and as warnings for those who might forget. In cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and Hiroshima, the memory was carved deep into the collective soul. The photographs of destroyed streets and empty eyes hung in museums and schools. Survivors' testimonies filled books and halls, their voices sometimes soft, sometimes trembling, but always alive. The world learned about the camps, the ghettos, the bombings, and the battles. It learned about bravery in small acts, a hidden child, a smuggled letter, a quiet resistance. Yet memory was never simple. It was tangled with politics, with pain, with the needs of nations to heal or to move forward. Some histories were told loudly, others were pushed to the margins. The Cold War shadowed remembrance with suspicion and division. In Eastern Europe, memories were shaped by new regimes and new truths, while in the West, other stories rose to prominence. The voices of those who had suffered sometimes clashed with the need to rebuild and to forget. Generations grew up with different understandings of the past. Some inherited the silence of their parents, others the urgency to remember. The price of memory was the tension between peace and truth, between forgetting and healing. On the personal level, families struggled with loss and absence. Mothers carried photographs of sons who never came home. Fathers remained silent about battles too terrible to speak of. Children asked questions that had no easy answers. Memory was a living thing, shaped by time but never fully tamed. It visited dreams and haunted quiet rooms. It was present in anniversaries marked with ceremony and in private moments of grief. The weight of memory shaped identity, of individuals, communities, and nations. It demanded reckoning with the past and questioned what it meant to move forward. The survivors' stories became a bridge between the horrors endured and the hopes of future generations. In art and literature, memory found new expression. Pain was shaped into poems, paintings, films that tried to capture the unspeakable. These works became part of the fabric of remembrance, offering ways to understand what words alone could not hold. In schools, children learned lessons not just from dates and battles, but from human stories of courage and loss. The world was changed by the price it paid to remember. It was a price paid in tears, in time, in the quiet spaces where history and emotion met. The effort to remember was an act of love. Love for those who had fallen, love for those who survived, and love for a future that might avoid the same darkness. But memory could also be a burden. It could trap people in the past, keeping wounds open. Some wished to move beyond, to build a new world without looking back. Others believed forgetting risked repeating mistakes. This tension shaped politics and culture, friendships and families. The lessons of the war were taught not only in history books, but in the way communities honored or ignored their past. The price of memory was also the price of silence. When stories went untold, when witnesses faded, when evidence was lost, the world risked losing itself again. That is why remembering was never just an act of looking back. It was a call forward, a quiet promise that the darkness would not claim the future. And so, across continents, people kept the memory alive. They gathered on anniversaries, they built museums, they shared stories in whispered tones. They carried the past not as chains, but as light, because memory was more than sorrow. It was survival. It was warning. It was love. It was the fragile thread that bound generations together, through time and through silence. The price was steep. The cost was the loss of innocence and the carrying of grief. But the world chose to pay it, so that the stories of the fallen would not be forgotten, so that the faces of the survivors would be honored, and so that the future might one day be free from the shadows cast by war. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind ashes and silence, but also space. Space for new life, new stories, new beginnings. The world after the war was a quiet place in many ways, not because there was no noise, but because the noise that remained carried a different weight. It was the weight of memory, of loss, and of cautious hope. The cities that had been reduced to rubble slowly stirred awake. Streets that once echoed with footsteps of soldiers and civilians now filled with the careful pace of builders and children. Cranes reached toward broken skies, and hammers tapped rhythm into the bones of shattered buildings. It was a slow process, rebuilding, not just of stone and steel, but of trust, of community, and of a sense that the world could still hold peace. Yet peace was fragile, often uncertain, and always carrying the scars of the past. The people who had lived through the war carried invisible marks, shadows in their eyes, tremors in their hands, silences in their voices. They spoke little of what had been, except in the quietest of moments. The war's echoes lived in their dreams and their waking thoughts alike. For some, the past was a wound never fully healed. For others, it was a reminder to hold close what remained. Family, home, the small acts of kindness that stitched life back together. The nations that had fought and bled were changed forever. Old powers had fallen, and new ones were rising. Borders were redrawn, alliances shifted, and a new order was being shaped. The United Nations emerged as a fragile hope to bind the world together, to prevent the horrors from returning. Yet the peace was uneasy, filled with suspicion and rivalry. The Cold War was on the horizon, a quiet shadow that would stretch over decades. Still, in the midst of this tension, ordinary people sought normalcy. Markets reopened. Schools filled with children's laughter. Gardens grew where bomb craters once yawned. Art and music found voice again, weaving stories of loss and hope into new forms. The fire had taken so much, but it had not taken the human spirit. Across continents, memorials rose, stone monuments, quiet parks, simple plaques that stood as reminders of what had been lost and what must never be forgotten. These places became sacred spaces for reflection, mourning, and sometimes forgiveness. The war was remembered not only in history books, but in the hearts of those who had lived it and those who followed. The survivors aged, their stories passed down like fragile heirlooms. Some spoke openly, while others guarded memories closely, their pain hidden beneath calm faces. New generations grew up knowing only the echoes of war, learning from parents and teachers the lessons carved in time. But the lessons were never simple. The price of peace was often the weight of memory, and memory itself could be a battlefield. In some places, scars remained on the land and in the people's souls. Divisions lingered, fueled by politics and old wounds. Reconciliation was a slow, fragile process. The fire had destroyed more than buildings and lives. It had shattered trust and hope. Yet from those ashes, new dreams emerged. Nations rebuilt schools and hospitals. Communities planted trees where forests had been burned. Children who had never known peace learned to dream of it. The world had changed. Technology advanced rapidly, shaped by the war's innovations, but also by a desire to avoid future destruction. The atomic age dawned, bringing both fear and fascination. The shadow of the bomb hung over the world, a reminder of how close humanity had come to self-destruction. And so, the story of what remained after the fire is a story of balance between remembering and moving forward, between grief and hope, between the past's weight and the future's light. It is a story told in quiet moments. A hand reaching out to comfort, a child's laughter breaking the stillness, a candle lit in memory. The fire had changed everything, but it had not broken everything. The world had been tested in its darkest hour and had survived. What remained was the chance to build anew, with eyes wide open to the cost of war and hearts willing to imagine peace. In the end, what remains after the fire is not just the ruins or the memories. It is the people who continue to live, to love, to remember, and to hope. It is the stories that pass from one generation to the next, whispered in the quiet and carried in the heart. It is the fragile thread that connects past and future, shadow and light, loss and renewal. And as the world turns slowly forward, it is this thread that holds the promise that the fire, though fierce and terrible, will not be the end of the story.